Evolutionary Science in the Catholic Church by Rev. Mr. Kevin W. Vogel. Read by Father Kevin W. Vogel. Evolutionary Science and the Catholic Church. Chapter 5. Human Uniqueness and Original Sin. Chapters 2 and 3 set the stage for the dialogue between evolutionary science and Catholic theology by giving an overview of the scientific discipline and the four areas the Church has addressed with regard to it. Chapter 4 considered the first two areas. It first explained the methods and limitations of science theology and their intermediary, philosophy, to show each as legitimate ways of knowing. This philosophy was then applied to show how science's description of chance events can be consistent with theology's understanding of God's divine providence. These two areas were considered first because their conclusions will be applied to formulating a correct understanding of the final two areas addressed by the Church in this chapter, human uniqueness and original sin. Human uniqueness. Recall from Chapter 3 that John Paul II's conditional acceptance of evolution allowed that the human body may come from pre-existing matter, but the soul could not simply emerge from matter alone. The spiritual soul marks a, quote, ontological discontinuity, end quote, that makes human nature different from the natures of all other physical beings, and prevents one from reducing the human person to his physical reality alone. Based on empirical observations and their subsequent interpretation in light of evolutionary theory, some scientists have been led to question the existence of the concept of nature in general. Following this conclusion, human nature is also questioned, as well as the possibility of the spiritual soul. In reaction to this, some theologians and philosophers have argued that philosophy rules out the possibility of evolution. Following John Paul II's call to explore the differences in the methods of science, theology, and philosophy, others have sought a reconciliation between evolution and the human soul. Before discussing each of these positions, what is meant by the concept of nature, and most specifically human nature, must be made clear. Nature and human nature. Recall from Chapter 4 that philosophy describes changing physical being in terms of four types of causes: material, efficient, formal, and final. The formal cause makes a material thing to be what it is, giving matter its arrangement and revealing the thing's inner reality. The formal cause of a thing, its substantial form, is what gives a thing the certain nature that it has. Footnote 273. The nature of a dog is that which the dog has within it that makes it to be a dog. To philosophically describe changes that occur to substances, the categories of potency and act are applied. From observing the world around us, we know that change exists and that many things have the potential within them to change. This capacity to change is called potency. For example, an apple seed has the potency to change into an apple tree. While it is a seed, it only has the potency for that change. But after the change, the tree is now in act. The tree is what now exists. To say something is in act is to say that it is in a current state of actual existence. Change is a movement from potency to act. Before the change, the seed was in act in being a seed, but in potency with respect to changing into a tree. After the change, the seed is no longer in act, but the tree is in act. Notice that something must be in act, it must exist, in order for it to undergo a change into something else. It is the nature of the thing, and thus also its form, that determines the kind of thing that is in act. Footnote 274. There are two basic kinds of change: accidental and substantial. When an accidental change occurs, some aspect of the thing changes, but the thing itself does not. Footnote 275. For example, when an apple is cut, it remains an apple even though it looks different due to the cut. It retains the form and nature that makes it an apple. When a substantial change occurs, the thing itself changes. The form and nature cease to make it that thing, and a new thing is produced with a new form and nature. For example, when the apple is eaten, the digestive process changes the apple into the nutrients usable by the body. The apple no longer exists with its specific nature. In order for a thing to undergo any change, it must have the specific potency for that change. The nature of a thing is what determines what kind of changes that thing can undergo. Footnote 276. During accidental change, the thing itself, substance, remains constant with respect to the change. During a substantial change, there must also be something that remains constant, so that there is no gap. It would be absurd to say that there was something, then nothing, then something else. What remains constant in a substantial change is called prime matter, matter conceived apart from any form. Footnote 277. Most substantial changes do not occur in isolation, but within a series of accidental changes. The accidental changes are observed, but the instantaneous change from one substance to another is not. After the fact, it is clear that a substantial change has taken place, but the exact moment is not observable. Footnote 278. The nature of a thing, based on its substantial form, is not only related to the formal cause, but also to its final cause. The nature of a thing causes that thing to be constructed from within to fulfill its final cause, its end or purpose. For the apple tree, its end is to be that which it is, an apple tree. This final cause does not require a conscious knowledge of its purpose, but it fulfills its end based on its nature. A thing's nature moves the thing from within to that which is the best possible for fulfilling that thing's end. For living things, this includes the propagation of their nature to their offspring. Footnote 279. The substantial form of living things is also called the soul. The soul not only fashions its constituent parts into an individual, but also enables it to have life. Different levels of living things have different types of souls that enable them to be what they are. Thus, the soul of an animal enables it to live at a level different from that of the soul of a plant. Human nature is that which is within the human person that makes him or her to be a human. Man has the faculties of intellect and will, through which he can reason and make choices in ways other living creatures cannot. This is because the substantial form or soul of the human person is significantly different from that of life forms like plants or animals. Unlike all other living beings, man's soul is spiritual, having the faculties of intellect and will. Having clarified the terminology used by philosophy to describe nature in general and the nature of the human soul, the arguments against this view can be understood. Evolution against human nature. It is not surprising to see proponents of evolution reject the philosophical framework including natures, since Aristotle himself seems to explicitly reject the possibility of evolution. Footnote 280. Immediately, it seems, there is the need to reject Aristotle's philosophy of nature, as well as his metaphysics, due to the new observations of evolutionary biology, which he could not make a part of his own biological observations that informed his philosophy of nature. One argument questioning the reality of natures begins with the philosophical understanding that the nature of a thing directs that thing to a purpose or end. Evolutionary science shows that species come about by chance, without an ordering to an end. If there is no end, there is no nature needed to direct it to that end. Therefore things do not have natures. Quote, because of the ubiquitous roles of accident, contingency, and history within the process of natural selection and within species formation and determination, the neo-Darwinian evolutionary account permits no talk of the nature or uniqueness of humankind, or for that matter, the nature of any living thing. End quote. Footnote 281. Based on the discussion on chance in the previous chapter, one can see the error in this first argument. The scientific use of chance is meant to describe the interaction between uncorrelated causal sequences, not absolutely random events that have no cause. Chance events can only occur between existing causes that are related to the natures of the things involved in the causes. Chance actually presupposes real things with real natures. Footnote 282. Further, recall that the methods of science, which do not look for final causes, cannot come to the conclusion that there are no final causes. Those scientists that do admit quasi-teleological conclusions, that things seem to be ordered to an end, are actually consistent with Aristotelian teleology. For in Aristotle's conception, when a thing's nature directs it to its end, it need not have a conscious knowledge or desire for that end. Footnote 283. A second argument, represented by sociobiologist E.O. Wilson and philosopher David Hull, begins with the assumption that if a thing has a nature, it must be defined by physical traits, and ultimately the genes that define them. Since genes are observed to vary among similar individuals over time, any nature based on genes would also be changing. Further, genes describe particular living beings, not a universal nature of a species. Hull states that, quote, genomes are localized, historical entities, and not generalizable or invariable, end quote, as seems to be required by the concept of nature. Footnote 284. Therefore, there is no stable nature determining a set of creatures to be the same kind of being. A species is not defined by having a single nature, but rather, quote, particular organisms belong to a particular species because they are part of that genealogical nexus, not because they possess any essential traits, end quote. Footnote 285. Since this argument is based on scientific evidence, it is not surprising to see the assumption of naturalism. Unfortunately, the naturalism used is not simply methodological, but rather ontological. The premise that nature must be defined solely by what is material cannot be established by the limitations of science. This alone puts the above argument in question. Second, the concept of nature can deal with the discrepancy between particular individual beings and a universal nature. Forms and the natures that they establish are found in particular things. One comes to know the natures of particular beings by abstracting from particulars to universal ideas. These ideas in our mind are subjective, dependent upon the objective, particular realities which have real forms that determine their natures. Third, defining a species by genealogical connection seems to make it impossible to tell if a new species has evolved. The evolution of species presumes new species are genealogically connected with previous species, but that same criterion is used for defining a single species. Such a dilemma could lead one to saying that there is simply a continuity of changing organisms, but no species, a conclusion leading to the absurdity that the evolution of species shows that there are no species to evolve. At the same time, the above argument does bring up a legitimate question. How can a species have a set nature and still be able to evolve into a new species with a new nature when its nature orders the species to reproduce the same nature in its offspring? As Fran O'Rourke comments, quote, the single greatest stumbling block in attempting to incorporate evolution into Aristotle's world is the fixity of species, end quote. Footnote 286. Such a question leads into the philosophical arguments made against evolution. Philosophy against evolution. One can formulate two main arguments against evolution related to the philosophical concept of nature. Footnote 287. The first utilizes the concepts of potency and act. As discussed previously, potency cannot pass into act without a prior act that has the potential for bringing the new act into being. Evolution proponents claim that in the evolution of species there is a passage from a lower order, primitive life forms, to a higher order, complex animals, without the presence of a higher cause. It is due to chance. Therefore, based on philosophical principles, it is not possible for evolution to occur. While this is a valid argument, the premise is based not on evolution as a science, but on a philosophically imbued version. Again, from the previous chapter's section on chance, one can see that chance, as uncorrelated causal sequences, does not exclude the possibility of prior causes. In fact, chance requires the prior act to bring potencies into act. Potenshine gives the same objection, explicitly recognizing it as being against only a false version of evolution, not necessarily against evolution as a whole. Quote, scholasticism is opposed to a certain form of evolution, and that form sets out as its basic principles that the ontological greater comes from that which is ontologically less. But the whole world of common sense is opposed to such a crudity, and science itself finds no interest in it. End quote. Footnote 288. It is right to argue against such a version of evolution, but since evolution as a science is not dependent upon this version of chance, one cannot conclude that evolution is false from it. The second argument relating to nature begins with the philosophical concept of substantial form. As discussed earlier, the substantial form makes a thing what it is. All things must have a substantial form, so changes between substantial forms must be immediate. Evolutionary change depends on a continuity of changes between species, rather than immediate change. Quote, "It cannot be understood how species with clearly distinct essences, or natures, can transform themselves into something substantially different through small steps in a continuous way." End quote. Footnote 289. The continuity of evolution denies differences in substantial forms, and thus differences in natures. Therefore, in order to retain form and nature, evolution must be denied. One cannot solve this discrepancy simply by defining the nature of something as to become what it is not. Sheen points out that this definition would deny the principle of identity, that its nature makes the thing to be what it is. It is contradictory to say that which makes the thing to be what it is that which makes it to become what it is not. Quote, "In such a case, there is nothing left to identify." End quote. Footnote 290. It does not seem proper to simply accept a philosophical conclusion that evolution as a science must be impossible. One must explain the facts empirical science observes, that there are different living beings now as compared to the past. This second argument exposes the greatest stumbling block of how to deal with the fixity of natures in light of evolution. Revealing the limitations of some arguments from both science and philosophy does not yet give positive results in showing how the concepts of nature and the human soul may be compatible with the development of new species in evolution. However, attempts to do so have been made from within both disciplines. Failed attempts to retain the human soul. Anne Clifford opts for a, quote, "generationism," end quote, where the soul is generated at conception in conjunction with the body. Despite the witness of Aquinas, Pius XII, and John Paul II, she insists that the soul could be an epiphenomenon emerging from the matter of the body. She is able to do this by reconceptualizing the soul as no longer a spiritual form of the body, but rather as, quote, "a metaphorical naming of the compilation of those elements that make each of us a unique individual with a capacity for transcendence." End quote. Clifford's attempt not only fails at upholding church teaching, but it also confuses philosophical truths. For example, Clifford argues against the need for God to intervene in the creation of the human soul, but, as was seen in the previous chapter, a proper understanding of how God's providence acts in creation answers this objection. Footnote 291. Joshua Mortiz argues from scientific observations for the existence of natures. He argues from a field of scientific study called biological structuralism that organisms have, quote, "specific generative powers," end quote, due to their overall structure. He looks to avoid reducing a thing's nature to genes, but is unwilling to go beyond his methodological naturalism. He is aware of the limitations of his ideas, for he knows his natures are, quote, "explanatory kinds, not metaphysical natures," end quote. He also unfortunately views the human soul as emerging, quote, "during embryological development," end quote. Mortiz admits that his methodology of using a scientific theory as the basis of a theology of the soul is a risk. While it is true that theology should draw on reason, including that which comes from science, it cannot exclude divine revelation. Science should not always have the last say. Footnote 292. Clifford and Mortiz are examples of attempts to retain natures and the human soul, as well as take evolution data seriously. Unfortunately, both fail to uphold all necessary philosophical and theological principles. Evolution and philosophy of nature. Thus far, all descriptions have failed to do justice to all three fields of science, philosophy, and theology. The greatest stumbling block of the fixity of species needs to be addressed. A few philosophers have undergone an evaluation of Aristotle, and thus Aquinas, to determine whether or not the rejection of evolution due to the fixity of species is a necessary requirement of his framework of philosophy of nature and metaphysics. There seem to be at least some arguments that the fixity of species is not required, and that the Aristotelian framework may be open to the possibility of evolution. If this is so, one need not reject either evolution or the Aristotelian or Thomistic philosophical tradition. Fianche Ryan begins an evaluation of Aquinas by recognizing how God, as the primary cause of a thing's being, works with secondary causes that particularize God's action. In conjunction with the primary cause, created things can produce new substances by their own power. Footnote 293. It seems that new kinds of animals can arise from other animals being produced out of a potency for them contained in the prior animal. Ryan quotes Aquinas, quote, "Species also that are new, if any such appear, existed beforehand in various active powers, so that animals, and perhaps even new species of animals, are produced by putrefaction, by the power which the stars and elements received at the beginning. Again, animals of new kinds arise occasionally from the connection of individuals belonging to different species, as the mule is the offspring of an ass and a mare. But even these existed previously in their causes, in the works of the 6 days." End quote. Footnote 294. Here Aquinas is answering the objection that creation was not complete on the 7th day of creation due to the observation of new beings. Any new creature with a new substantial form must have existed in potency in what came before it. The combined acts of the primary and secondary causes would be required to bring about the new being. Ryan does not explore the possibility very far, but comments that Aquinas' thought seems to be open to the evolution of new species. Footnote 295. Stephen Snyder and Fran O'Rourke explore in greater detail how a new creature could be said to evolve within the Aristotelian philosophical framework. O'Rourke explains that it is correct to think of an organism as a single substance with its own substantial form. At the same time, organisms are made up of multiple components that each retain a certain identity, even while being subordinate to the overall unity of the organism. O'Rourke cites Aristotle and Aquinas. Quote, "Aristotle himself notes that while the elements do not actually persist in a compound, neither are they destroyed or altered, for their power is preserved." Commenting on this text, Aquinas notes that the forms of the elements are present in compounds not actually, but virtually. The individual is thus determined not only by its own substantial form, but embraces within itself a multiplicity of subsidiary forms which retain the power of their specific nature. End quote. Footnote 296. This is an important distinction to make. While the parents are the principal causes in the reproductive process that brings about the next generation of offspring, they act through instrumental causes that are subordinate components of each parent. These subordinate components are the gametes, sperm and ovum, that come together to produce the new individual. While related to the formal powers and potencies of the parents, these gametes act due to their own formal powers and potencies. Because they are instruments of the parents as the principal causes, when combined, the gametes can achieve an effect beyond the limits of their own natures, that of the new offspring. The effects are brought about through the formal powers and potencies of the gametes, so their substantial forms make a great difference to the outcome. Footnote 297. When the coming together of the gametes, each with their own substantial form, produces the zygote, the initial cell of the new organism, with its own substantial form, a substantial change has taken place. Since the gametes do not have the same substantial form as the zygote, the sperm or ovum alone do not make the new organism. The zygote could not have come about through an accidental change, but only through a substantial one. Aristotle and Aquinas would have had no reason not to assume the formal powers and potencies of the gametes, as derived from the parents, would produce offspring with a substantial form like that of the parents. As noted before, natures are ordered to the final cause of producing their form again in their offspring. Aquinas was aware that the original form of the parents may not be able to produce the same form, so in that case a form as close to that of the original would be produced. Quote, each natural thing produces something similar to itself in species, unless something beyond nature happens to result, as when a horse begets a mule. In the generation of a mule, the sperm of a horse cannot induce the form of a horse in the matter, because it is not adapted to receive the form of a horse. It therefore induces a related form. Hence, in the generation of a mule, the generator is similar in a way to the thing generated, for there is a proximate genus. In reference to that genus, it can be said that like generates like. End quote. Footnote 298. Snyder then brings up the differences observed to exist between the genetic information of the parents and the genetic information within their gametes. Unknown to Aristotle and Aquinas, we know that such differences are possible due to gene mutation. When the combination of the gametes establishes the form of the zygote, their formal powers and potencies affect the form produced in the zygote. Snyder explains that, quote, these mutations, being changes of attributes, can be expressions of a substantial form different from that of the parent generation, since attributes depend for their existence on substantial form. Differences in significant properties are caused by substantial differences. End quote. Footnote 299. At the same time, a mutation of the gametes need not always lead to the production of offspring whose form is different from the parents, i.e., be a new species. The substantial form of the mutated offspring may or may not be different from the parents, depending upon whether or not the mutation allowed the form toward which the parents were ordered. If the offspring is substantially different from the parents, this does not necessarily mean a new biological species has been produced. The new substantial form of the offspring, which the nature of the parents ordered to be as close as possible to the form of the parents, is not a new biological species, but rather a, quote, intermediate and imperfect participation in the posterior and subsequent species, end quote. Snyder uses the concept of substantial change as an analogy to explain the formation of a new species. Just as a substantial change occurs within a series of accidental changes, so too a new species is recognized out of a series of substantial changes. Footnote 300. As one cannot observe a substantial change directly but recognizes it afterward, so too one cannot easily pinpoint the place where one biological species ends and another begins, but can attest to a difference in species existing. O'Rourke notes how Aristotle recognizes, as modern evolutionary biology does, that biological species are difficult to differentiate. Quote, nature proceeds from the inanimate to the animals by such small steps that, because of the continuity, we fail to see which side the boundary and the middle between them belongs. End quote. Footnote 301. It seems that the philosophical problems will arise if one thinks the only substantial change that occurs is at a single transition point between biological species. This creates a conflict between evolution's conception of a continuous process and the philosophical requirement of immediate substantial change. In actuality, a substantial change occurs at the reproduction of each new organism. Thus, there is a continuum of immediate substantial changes behind the transition from one species to another. Snyder explains, quote, such a new species has come about not by infusion of form from without, but by numerous substantial changes by nature and substantial changes by chance, from mutations, taking place over time in a complicated and dynamic environment, which would include effects from genetic drift, selection, and gene flow. End quote. Footnote 302. Problems may also arise if one forgets that substantial forms are incarnate realities that exist in individuals themselves. Quote, the species subsists in its members. End quote. That is, our mind recognizes that a group of individuals all have the same nature and thus knows them to be of the same species. Footnote 303. Substantial forms and natures are dependent upon the objective realities of the individuals. If, however, one conceives natures as existing as universals apart from individuals, the Platonic understanding, then changes from one form to another would become inexplicable. Natures are first incarnate realities in individuals, and secondly known through universal ideas in the mind. A further question can be asked, though, about the observation of genetic differences between the parent and their gametes. How does one think of genetic changes in light of substantial forms? As subordinate components, genes too have their own forms. O'Rourke comments that, quote, "It is in the nature of genes to adapt and mutate while still performing their stable function of transmitting the code of life." End quote. Footnote 304. It is not clear what O'Rourke means by this, for he refrains from going into further detail. It could be interpreted to mean that the natures of genes is to change their nature, which would reach the absurdity mentioned earlier of denying the principle of identity. Perhaps a more consistent understanding would be to think of genes as having certain potentialities for certain changes that can be brought into act through the prior act of uncorrelated causes, chance. The substantial forms themselves are not evolving, but rather forms are being brought into and out of act in a series of immediate substantial changes. If one accepts that a species could, through a series of substantial changes over generations of offspring, lead to a new species, would this only apply to changes from a higher to a lower form, as in Aquinas' mule example? Or would changes to more complex organisms also be possible, as is required by macroevolution? Such a change would require a prior act that has the potential for bringing the new act, the higher form, into being. As discussed in Chapter 4, God ordinarily works through secondary causes that arise out of the natures of things. God, as the primary cause, could order secondary causes to prepare matter, via combinations of their natures, chance mutations, etc., in such a way as to enable the matter to receive a new, higher substantial form, creating a more complex organism. This would be one way to think of the transition from lower organisms to higher, more complex ones using Aristotelian Thomistic categories, as applied to observations made from evolutionary science. This, of course, is not meant to be a scientific explanation, but a possible philosophical description. Finally, if one insists that a series of immediate substantial changes is far too discontinuous to be reconcilable with evolution, one has only to look at the observations of evolution itself to see that the process of evolution, even at the level of physical observations, is a series containing discontinuities. Recall, for example, the observations of the neo-selectionists, who posit a series of neutral point mutations leading up to a critical mutation that can be selected or not by natural selection. This change from a conservative mode to a transitional mode marks something of a discontinuity. See Chapter 2. This scientific observation seems parallel to the philosophical idea that the change from one species to another could be described by a series of substantial changes, but one should not necessarily take them as being equivalent. The human soul. The previous section argued that an Aristotelian framework can support either a world in which species remain fixed or one in which new species evolve. Since the Church's understanding of the human soul depends in part upon this philosophical framework, it was essential to show its compatibility with evolution before addressing the human soul. As described before, Church documents allow for the possibility that bodies leading up to a body fit to receive the human soul could have evolved, but that the soul itself could not have. In light of the previous discussion on evolution as a series of substantial changes, there appears to be no opposition to such an ontological transition. The creation of each new offspring marks a substantial change where the potencies in the parent's gametes allow for the actualization of the form of the offspring. So too, for the first transition to human offspring, and all subsequent ones, the gametes contain the potential to receive the substantial form of the spiritual soul. The difference between the two is that the non-spiritual substantial forms of the gametes can, as instruments of the parents, actualize a non-spiritual form of the offspring, but cannot of themselves actualize a spiritual form. Thus, a cause that can actualize a spiritual form is required. To say this cause is God does not introduce a God of the gaps mentality, for God acts as the primary cause behind the secondary causes throughout the entire natural process. His non-disruptive infusion of the human soul is a continuation of his action as the primary cause of everything that exists. Feingold argues that the transition from any pre-existing non-human body to a body fit for the human soul would require a direct intervention by God, just as it would for the soul. Quote, "Given that the soul is the form of the body, an essential difference in the soul necessarily has fundamental consequences with regard to the disposition of the body and to the perfection and disposition of its organs." End quote. Footnote 305. This would seem to also be supported by John Paul II's catechesis on the theology of the body. The body shows forth the reality of the invisible soul of the person, so it would seem to place the Church's whole concept of sacramentality into question if there were to be a non-human with the body of a human. Footnote 306. Thus, it would seem, the human body, because it is ordered by its spiritual form, could not have evolved from previous matter without the infusion of the spiritual soul. This insight from Feingold is an important one, yet it need not render all connection to previous non-human bodies impossible. Footnote 307. The transition from one species to another, understood as a series of substantial changes over multiple generations, would seem to be consistent with the infusion of the spiritual soul changing the disposition of the matter it receives from the gametes, since the change from the gametes to the zygote must already be a substantial one. One may further object that the infusion of the soul would be contrary to the nature of the pre-existing being connected in some way to the first man, be it the infusion of the human soul into a non-human, which appears to be impossible from the previous paragraph, or the infusion of the soul into the offspring of a non-human. Would it not be contrary to the nature of a thing to have offspring that does not have the same nature? As described above, in the process of one species evolving into another, mutated offspring that do not have the same substantial form as the parents are still imperfect participations in the previous species. It would seem that the infusion of the spiritual soul, a substantial form quite different from any non-spiritual form, would not allow one to speak of an imperfect participation. W. Norris Clark has a helpful insight into the nature of being that can help one understand how the infusion of the spiritual soul by God, while being a real ontological discontinuity, would not damage prior beings or the natural order in any way. Starting with a broad metaphysical view, he describes all that exists, being, in a relational way. Quote, "To be is to be substance in relation." End quote. All individual beings cannot help but be connected in some way to other beings. The human person is a specific manifestation of substance in relation. The way persons can relate to one another is a mode of relation that is fuller than any other relation. Thus Clark says, quote, "To be fully is to be personally." End quote. The perfection of a being, the end to which its form orders it, is to be able to be in relation as fully as its mode of being will allow it. The infusion of the spiritual soul by God would not be a disruption of this ordering, but rather would allow a being, quote, "to be fully what it tends to be by nature," end quote, to be able to relate personally. Instead of doing damage to the order of nature, the infusion of the soul enables it to overcome the limitations of its previous mode of nature. Footnote 308. There is a potency of relationality that only reaches the act of personal relation through the higher act of the non-disruptive action of God. Is this evolution? This framework accounts for, but no longer matches the framework of biological evolution put forth in Chapter 2, for it goes beyond the realm of science to include philosophy. Assuming the philosophical framework showing how the human body and soul came to be in light of evolution, can one really say that humans evolved? Due to the immediate creation of the human soul by God, one cannot say that humans evolved in exactly the same way that other animals evolved. If one is to speak of man evolving, one cannot do so univocally with biological evolution. This, of course, does not negate biological evolution. Scientists already admit they cannot speak univocally of cosmic evolution, footnote 309, and biological evolution, since each has its own methods of study and mechanisms explaining the phenomena. Thus, it is nothing new to say that human evolution cannot be spoken of univocally with biological evolution. Based on biological evolution, some scientists will make the claim that humans are also in the process of evolving beyond their current state to become new organisms. This reasoning fails to see the equivocal use of evolution with regard to non-human and human life. Just as principles from cosmic evolution cannot be used to determine that humans will evolve, so too biological evolution cannot determine if there is an evolutionary stage beyond humans. While Benedict XVI has analogously spoken of our redemption and deification in Christ as a kind of, quote, evolutionary transition, end quote, there is no evidence to support a further biological evolution of the human being. Any such transition from human to something beyond human, an angel for example, appears contrary to the resurrection of the body and immortality of the human soul. So can one say under this framework that humans evolved? Yes and no. Human evolution can only be analogous to biological evolution, never univocal. Other questions with regard to the situation surrounding the origin of man can be asked. For example, with concern for theology, one may ask how the human race could come from one man. Also, would the lines leading to Adam and Eve have developed separately? Footnote 310. Questions about the specific details of the origin of man inevitably will include much speculation. Some authors have made attempts into these areas where it is difficult to come to complete conclusions. Footnote 311. For this work, such questions lead us into the discussion on polygenism and original sin. Polygenism and original sin. As was noted in Chapter 3, comparatively little has been said by the Church with regard to the issue of evolution and how it affects the doctrine of original sin. The question, however, of how the two could be reconciled was asked by members of the Church very soon after Darwin published his ideas. Evolution claimed that man, like all other living creatures, had come into existence through the natural process of one species becoming other species over time. This looked to be contradictory to the biblical understanding of the origin of man created by God. Further, the current theory proposed that man evolved separately in multiple places, which would mean multiple parents, polygenism, rather than the biblical account of one set of first parents, monogenism. This understanding, combined with historical critical methods of exegesis, seemed to place the historicity of Adam and Eve in jeopardy. The Church's conception of the nature of original sin had always been understood as beginning in the personal sin of Adam and Eve, and through our solidarity with them, sin extending to all subsequent generations of man. If polygenic evolution was true, with man having his origin in many places at different moments in history, it seemed impossible for Adam to be a historical person. Footnote 312. If the historicity of Adam is in question, so too would it put in question the transition from an unfallen original state of man, through a personal sin, into its current fallen state. Not only was the doctrine of original sin at stake, but also the role of Christ's redemption. For, as was noted in Chapter 3, one, quote, cannot tamper with the revelation of original sin without undermining the mystery of Christ, end quote. Footnote 313. Attempts at integration were made, but the controversial nature of the subject of evolution and the Church's wariness of the errors of modernism, footnote 314, worked against attempts by theologians to advance speculative theories. For example, articles written by the French Jesuit priest and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin in the 1920s through the 1940s raised quite an opposition. His main writings were not allowed to be published until after his death in 1955. Footnote 315. This came after the encyclical Humani Generis was published, in which Pius XII allowed the idea of the human body as a product of evolution to be explored, but warned that it was not apparent how polygenism could be reconciled with the doctrine of original sin. The unintended result of the encyclical was to attract even more attention to the issue of original sin. Combined with an atmosphere of openness that was felt surrounding the Second Vatican Council, theologians began to feel free to speak about original sin in ways they could not before. Unfortunately, theologians had the tendency to take the newfound freedom too far, and to cease to uphold substantial elements of the traditional teaching of original sin, as was described in Chapter 3. Footnote 316. It is beyond the scope of this work to chronicle each individual theologian's means of speaking about original sin in a way that seemed to solve the problem with polygenism. Insofar as their new way of speaking about original sin denied some substantial part of the doctrine of original sin, it cannot be accepted by the Church. Footnote 317. For example, if one reinterprets original sin to be, quote, merely a symbolic mythical expression to designate the natural deficiencies of a creature like man, end quote, it is not just original sin that is redefined. Ratzinger points out that in that case, quote, salvation would simply mean moving toward the future as the necessary development to the better. There has never been a redemption because there was no sin on account of which man would need to be healed, end quote. Footnote 318. Following Ratzinger, Donald Keefe points out the importance of the moral nature of the fall. That is, original sin has at its source a personal choice not to give one's whole self to God. Footnote 319. Because of its origin in a personal choice, original sin cannot be understood simply as the collective sins of humanity, but requires a personal first sin through which sin enters the world. A theory proposed by a theologian showing that polygenism is compatible must show its compatibility with the traditional Catholic doctrine of original sin. The rejection or reformulation of the doctrine avoids the issue entirely. No conclusive argument showing compatibility between original sin and polygenism can be made if one changes the meaning of original sin. Footnote 320. Correct theological methodology. The failed attempts by theologians to explain original sin in light of polygenism was in part due to an incorrect methodology. As described in Chapter 4, theology and science, as two different categories of thought, have distinct methodologies. Based on both faith and reason, theology is broader in its understanding of the world than biological evolution, which only looks at material being through reason. By its very method, evolution cannot incorporate belief in creation or original sin. Footnote 321. Thus, it is improper to use scientific findings like polygenism to determine the theology of original sin. This improper application of method applies as well to the use of the historical critical biblical interpretation. Footnote 322. As described in Chapter 4, proper exegesis should indeed avoid a, quote, naively literalist interpretation, end quote, of Genesis, knowing that it does not teach science. At the same time, Genesis cannot be reduced to unhistorical myth. Pius XII wrote in Humani Generis, quote, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, although properly speaking not conforming to the historical method used by the best Greek and Latin writers, or by competent authors of our time, do nevertheless pertain to history in a true sense, which, however, must be further studied and determined by exegetes. The same chapters both state the principal truths which are fundamental for our salvation, and also give a popular description of the origin of the human race and the chosen people. Whatever of the popular narrations have been inserted into the sacred scriptures must in no way be considered on a par with myths, or other such things, which are more the product of an extravagant imagination than of that striving for truth and simplicity." Footnote 323. Scripture must be read in light of the whole salvation history, acknowledging, for example, Paul's use of Adam as a type of Christ. Romans 5. Footnote 324. Ratzinger further explains that original sin is not a fact in the same way as events that are known from observable history. Original sin is known rather through biblical typology, recognized in the type of Adam. To know about original sin through the type of Adam is not to reduce him to a myth. Quote, "God does not act with abstractions or concepts. The type exists as a person." End quote. Footnote 325. To say that Adam is a type depends upon him being a person. Keith sees the attempt to understand Adam and original sin as one observable historical event among all others to be the root of the confusion between polygenism and original sin. Beginning with Teilhard, the fall of Adam was placed within historical time, a time which is fallen. Footnote 326. Keith upholds the event of the original sin and fall as a historical event, but not an event within the fallen order of time. Quote, "The event of original sin and fall, as historical and objective, is not thereby to be understood to be within the fallen order of time. Rather, original sin is the primordial principle, the a priori cause of the fallenness of the historical order, as of the fall of the entirety of the good creation. Therefore it cannot be rendered theologically intelligible by its submission to the immanent necessities governing the fallen universe of space and time, whether or not these be adequately articulated in a theory of evolution." End quote. Footnote 327. Since original sin is the prior cause of the fallenness of the historical order, as we now observe it, this first event cannot be part of the fallen order. To place it within fallen time would actually remove its historical nature as the initiating moment of fallen time. Footnote 328. Thus, the concept of original sin cannot be understood using observations from this fallen order. One cannot speak of a time before the fall, since to speak of time would necessarily be to understand it through our fallen experience of time. Quote, "We know no unfallen time, no unfallen space. There are no pre-Adamites. It is all fallen. There isn't anything we encounter that is not fallen. The principle of integration, then, in this fallen universe has to be given prior to the fall. In a sense, it has to transcend the fall." End quote. Footnote 329. The concepts of monogenism and polygenism arise from the way we observe the fallen world, but original sin preceded such a state. Instead of drawing from fallen time, the quote, "moment of the emergence of death, of the emergence of fallenness, has to be dealt with in entirely biblical terms." End quote. Footnote 330. Keith proceeds to do exactly that, developing a theology of the fall based on the covenantal nature of creation. Footnote 331. More so than most theologians before him, Keith makes great effort to uphold Catholic teaching on original sin, and he seems to succeed. At the same time, he opens more questions one could ask. For example, how can God create a world that is good and yet, as Keith does, equate the moment of creation and the fall? Footnote 332. Where then is the good creation if it is only actualized as fallen? Footnote 333. Where is man's freedom of choice if there is no time in which to make it? Perhaps the reason one may find this difficult to conceptualize is that one cannot help but think in categories drawn from fallen time. This, quote, "primordial historical actuality," end quote, of the free choice to reject God's plan for them cannot be understood through these categories. Keith points out that one really cannot answer these questions fully. Quote, "We cannot get behind the fall by speculation, and within the historical method required of any Catholic systematic theology, we are methodologically forbidden that indulgence." End quote. Footnote 334. Instead, one must look forward to Christ and the new covenant. What God offered in the good creation, that which was rejected by man, can only be understood in the light of Christ. Footnote 335. While it is an important insight that the doctrine of original sin cannot be formulated in fallen categories, Keefe's understanding of the fall outside of fallen time does not actually avoid the question of polygenism. When Adam and Eve fall through the primordial event of original sin, they enter into fallen time. After the fall, their existence within fallen creation would be open to our observation and open to critique based on categories like monogenism and polygenism. Thus, as helpful as Keefe may be, the issue of polygenism remains. Monocentrism and polycentrism. What has been described so far with regard to original sin is based on the acceptance by theologians that evolutionary science showed that polygenism had occurred, thus creating the conflict with the doctrine of original sin. What needs to be discussed is exactly what science can show with regard to monogenism and polygenism. At the time the earlier theologians were writing, fossil evidence seemed to indicate to some scientists that morphologically modern human beings appeared in multiple places that were separate from one another. Footnote 336. Different versions of multi-regional theories can be called polycentrism, as opposed to theories proposing morphologically modern human beings appeared in only one place, called monocentrism. While polycentrism began as the leading theory, the addition of evidence from molecular biology has made monocentrism the leading theory today, as described in Chapter 2. Footnote 337. Monocentrism and polycentrism must be distinguished from monogenism and polygenism, which refer to a single set of parents and multiple sets of parents, respectively. The distinction is important because evolutionary science actually determines the difference between monocentrism and polycentrism, not monogenism and polygenism. Footnote 338. Recall from Chapter 2 that speciation begins to occur when a small population is isolated from the main species. Since it is a population that forms the basis of the new species, polygenism is automatically assumed. Thus, beginning with the interpretive structure of evolutionary theory, any version of human origins automatically assumes polygenism, be it polycentric or monocentric. It is more likely that the population consists of more than one pair. At the same time, it is possible, though not likely in the eyes of the scientist, that a population be one pair. Because of this, Zaczynski observes that, quote, there are no methods of empirical research that allow the monocentrist to determine the size of the set of individuals who initiated the new stage in our history at that single center, end quote. Footnote 339. Augustin Kasuja also agrees, quote, to presume polygenism categorically, we would be presuming to affirm what paleontology itself cannot yet affirm with certainty, end quote. Footnote 340. Since the current well-established theory of the origin of morphologically modern human beings is monocentrism, for Zaczynski the problem of polygenism is solved. Does it rest on the current state of science holding monocentrism over polycentrism? Insofar as science can only determine the origin of morphologically modern human beings, but never the presence of the human soul, even polycentrism would allow for the possibility of monogenism. It could be that only one of the separate populations, consisting of a single pair of parents, actually were infused with the human soul, while the rest simply remained morphologically close to human beings. Even if there were physical evidence of morphologically modern human beings occurring in separate places, the scientists could not establish that each were infused with the human soul. Yet, building from Ficini's argument from Chapter 2 that the presence of man could be determined by external signs that indicate that an individual has man's higher capabilities, and thus a spiritual soul, one could conceive of finding such external signs from individual morphologically modern human beings stemming from separate populations. Footnote 341. Such might be a case in which theology would indeed have to deal with polygenism, as Keefe tries to, for example. For this kind of polycentrism would seem to indicate polygenism, not monogenism. At first this may seem like theology is relying on science to ensure its teachings, but it may be more proper to see it as theology prudently waiting out the changing developments of science. Mystery of original sin. It is quite apparent that evolution has led theologians like Ratzinger and Keefe to ponder questions that are difficult to articulate, while striving to think within the tradition of the Church. While it is necessary to have such discussions with the natural sciences regarding original sin, Ratzinger points out that it will not be sufficient. The truth of original sin is in some ways evident, but is also a mystery. It is evident through our history of ruptured relationships, yet it remains a mystery. Quote, "If we are not able to penetrate to the depths the reality and consequences of original sin, it is precisely because it exists, because the derangement is ontological, because it unbalances, confuses in us the logic of nature." End quote. Footnote 342. Evil and sin do not find their origin in reason, so will always escape our full understanding. Footnote 343. End of Chapter 5 of Evolutionary Science and the Catholic Church by Reverend Mr. Kevin W. Vogel. Read by Father Kevin W. Vogel.